In this video, we're looking at Inspector calls, and we've got 18 key quotations, 3 quotations for every character that I think that you need to know. And if you know these quotations, you're a long way there. Okay? And if you look at my direct knowledge, I've got this idea that character symbols always want you thinking, what is Priestley using these characters to suggest? Okay, so the first one we've got is Burling, and Burling is clearly a representation of the ignorant, self-centered, and avaricious, lust for money of middle classes. Priestley wants us to see him as not only a bad person, but he reminds us that money doesn't buy him or anybody class or intelligence. And Priestley shows us that he doesn't change, and that's his key message. Societies will always have people who only care about themselves and don't consider change. One of the big quotations in this text for me is that one, unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable, that he says about the Titanic. We've got repetition in there, and because he repeats unsinkable, it shows real confidence in what he's doing. We've got this sense of dramatic irony as well. We know that the Titanic does sink and the character doesn't, and because of that dramatic irony, we see him as ridiculous. This sense of arrogance about him. But really importantly, what I want you to understand is the significance of the Titanic. Okay, so the Titanic is that representation of a class system. Okay, the rich would be at the top in the most expensive cabins, the poor would be at the bottom. And when Burling suggests that the Titanic can't sink, he's suggesting that the class system will never sink, and he will be at the top forever. And by the end of the play, we know that's changing. We know that's how ridiculous that he is. Burling loves the Titanic because it represents a class system and it represents luxury. And that's what he likes. He calls himself a hard-headed man of business. Key metaphor, hard, okay? The idea that something can't be changed. He is proud of the fact of him being hard-headed. He celebrates it. All right. If something's hard, nothing can kind of get into it. It's like a shell. So you might think, well, he's similar to Scrooge at that point. Soldier is an oyster. It's a metaphor of ignorance to us. If he's hard-headed, nothing can get through. There's no humanity, no empathy. He basically celebrates his greed. At the end, we know that he hasn't changed. Well, go to bed then, and don't stand there being hysterical. And he says that to Eric and Sheila. We know that Eric and Sheila have changed. Look at the imperatives. Look how he commands those young adults like the children. He's deluded. He's silly. He's stupid. We are meant to see him as an idiot. We've seen these characters grow and change, and the fact that he still treats them as a child shows how silly he is. Think about that adjective, hysterical. They're not hysterical. What they're doing is they're showing emotions, and he thinks to show emotions makes you hysterical, basically, that you can't control yourself. He sees them being sorry as being ridiculous, and we realise that by that point he'll never change. He'll always be the villain. Mrs. Burling represents that idea of the upper classes of Edwardian England being cold, unfeeling and harsh. Priestley wants us to think of her as unpleasant. He places her against women like Eva and at the end Sheila to show that some people have no empathy or no class. And, she doesn't change. Again, Priestley's message, some people are incapable of change, and often it's those people who have the most who are unwilling to change. In that opening stage direction, she's called a rather cold-looking woman. Even before she speaks, we're told that she's unfeeling. Priestley prejudices us against these characters. We expect her to be exactly the way that she is. Cold, we know from A Christmas Carol, no humanity, no warmth, no love. Think about how she talks about Eva, girls of that class. Really important quotation. That noun girl, even though Eva's a woman, Mrs. Burling demeans and she patronises her. She basically says that she's a child, even though she's lived an unsheltered life and she's fully adult. She dehumanises her when she uses that word that. She talks about her as being like a thing. Priestley suggests, really importantly, that there's no female unity, there's no feminism between Mrs. Burling and Eva. And that's the ultimate tragedy. She can't even rely on other women. I think Priestley presents Mrs. Burling as showing no love and care to Eva, to show the people, girls or women like Eva, working class women, had no chance. If she can't rely on a fellow woman, what chance does she have? Think about Mrs. Burling at the end, from the way you children talk. Again, much like Burling, she's talking to Sheila and Eric there. You know, she's more explicit. She calls her grown-up children children. She demeans them. She's got no respect. We've seen them mature, change, grow, but she doesn't. Okay? Shows that she doesn't understand the change, so they can't change again. Priestley's message: money doesn't buy you intelligence. Sheila, then, at the beginning, she's materialistic and self-centered, younger generation. However, a change at the end is a moment of hope. She represents this idea of New Britain, based on empathy, classless understanding. Priestley wants us to understand that women do have a voice and they can change when some people can't. I want you to understand that up to a point, she's a bit of an idol for us in the 21st century. You know, we all do wrong at times, but you know, she's the first one to have capacity for change. She goes from materialistic to sorrowful and understanding. Priestley shows us that if we see the error of her ways, we can move on. Think about it at the beginning. Look, Mummy, into beauty when she talks about the ring, that really important symbol, the ring. You know, an imperative command to her parents. Look what I've got. How proud she is of her possessions at that point. She uses that childish noun, mummy. Priestley presents her as sheltered. Okay, and he wants us to understand that she's ignorant of real life. That quotation symbolises what he thought about the upper classes. You know, this sense that they basically just are permanently like children. You know, they don't really know what real life is. So I really like that. Okay, the ring symbolises the perfect life that she's got. Why, you fool? He knows. She says that to Gerald. Think about how her language changes in this text. She moves from childish language to emotive, adult-like. Some of us might use the term inspectorization of a language. She becomes like the inspector. She sounds like the inspector, brutal, harsh, to the point. And that shows a change. Priestley wants us to respect that she finds her voice and her morals. Gerald doesn't really deserve anybody's respect, and look how she describes him as a fool there. You know, he's the richest character in this, and she takes him on because she realises that he's wrong. We talked about the ring earlier. Everything's all right now. Sheila holds up the ring. What about this ring? No, not yet. It's too soon. I must think. Okay. This ring is the symbol, the prop of an old materialistic, high-class kind of, you know, aesthetic life. By refusing that ring, she refuses to go back to the way things are. That is a visual metaphor for this woman who has changed. When she refuses the ring, she refuses old life. Eric. At the beginning, he's the representation of this controlling man who thinks that money and status can get you whatever you want. And we know that he does dreadful things. He sees the error in his ways, but his actions do mean that we still see his villainy. Priestley wants to see that he's a bad person, and he acts in the way that he's been taught by his father. You know, when he kind of acts in the way that he does to Eva, it's because he's basically seen that in the other men in his life, in your Geralds and your Burlings. But the fact that he's the one who sees the error in his ways does offer some hope for the future. And he changes, doesn't he? He's misogynistic and he's presumptuous. And he is sheltered and he's self-centered at the beginning. But by the end, he's quite visceral in his sorrow. And that shows that he's willing to see morals. Love this quotation. Takes the decanter and helps himself. Okay, key stage direction. I just think there's so much metaphor in that. That stage direction in the right at the beginning is a metaphor for Eric. He takes what he wants and he doesn't even think of others. Doesn't ask. Okay? It foreshadows how he takes Eva and he uses her. And it also foreshadows when he takes the money from Burling. You know, you've also got the symbolism of his drink problem as well. And I just want you to understand that it symbolises Priestley's view that the rich just take what they want and don't even think about it. He's young and he doesn't have morals. Okay, so I haven't got it typed on this, but, you know, the inspector tells Eric, you've treated her like an animal, a thing, not a person. And you know, you've got that simile like an animal there, and it shows the lack of kind of consideration or the lack of humanity that he has. I want you to also think about the syntax of it, the way that it is short sentences, brutal, animal, thing, not a person. That is what the inspector's like, okay, to the point, without metaphor, without flowery language and things like that. It acts as a really kind of severe kind of devastating, forceful conclusion, really, to what his character is. Okay? Think about those words, animal, thing, not a person. We're told that Eric treats her as a piece of meat. Okay, that there's no humanity within there. I think that's really important. I don't care, let him know. The money's not the important thing. It's what happened to the girl and what we all did to her that matters. That key theme, responsibility, alive and well there. Think about that statement, the money's not the important thing. You know, at the beginning he's taking a decanter and helping himself, and by the end he's come to that conclusion. What we all did to her that matters. Forceful, to the point. Again, this kind of inspectorization of his language. There's quite a few quotations that show Eric's change. You know, you killed her, damn you, that he says to his parents when he damns them to hell and tells them that they're immoral. But yeah, all those show kind of Eric's change. Okay, character of Gerald. The privileged classes who do what they want and think they're above the rules. That's what he represents. He's self-absorbed and self-centered. He puts on a front of being respectable, but there's little to respect about him. And again, he doesn't change. He's younger, but he's more like the older generation. You know, Priestley presents Gerald as just a, you know, kind of immoral, rich man. And by him not changing at the end, makes this play more realistic. Not everybody who's young is going to change the world, like Sheila. Okay? Some people are stuck in the Edwardian ways. I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women. The way that he talks about women is important because it matches to kind of how he thinks Sheila should just like bow to him and how he just uses Eva for his own gratification. He objectifies them dough-faced, you know, as if they're being kind of created. He demeans them. There's no care or empathy within there. It's a patronisation of the lower class, a symbol of privilege and ignorance. Young, fresh and charming. Nearly any man would have done it. He's talking about Eva Smith there, and I always think it's interesting the way that he talks about her young, fresh and charming. And he talks about her like a possession, like something that he's buying, you know. It actually sounds quite sinister. He sounds a little bit predatory in the way that he talks about this young woman. And charming implies that he's been tricked or hypnotised by her because, you know, one thing that Gerald will never do is take responsibility for his own actions. When he's found out, he says any man would have done the same, or nearly any man would have done it. Priestley suggests this is a man who's got money but no responsibility. He justifies his own actions with that declaration. It's not only him. He sounds a little bit like a child in the way that he does that. And I think perhaps Priestley makes the point that money doesn't buy you morals. Okay? And then this one we've talked about before, but I just think it's so important. We talked about it with Sheila. Everything's all right now, Sheila. What about this ring? That ring representing old life. By offering it, it shows that Gerald hasn't learned. He's deluded. He thinks that something like this can happen and we can just give that ring back and go back to how things were. Priestley wants to see his total ignorance. There's no empathy. There's no sorrow. And he's the antithesis, really, of Sheila at the end. You got that juxtaposition of kind of change and refusal, or kind of not being able to change. The inspector, the voice of Priestley's socialist vision, the voice that attacks privilege. Priestley's voice on the stage, okay, the moral voice to the audience, the voice that makes this a morality play. He's the voice of the 1945 reality and modernity or force change on others. And we know that his language doesn't change because it's intent and it's strong. And that makes him authentic. Remember that he wears a dark plainish suit of the period. Okay, the Burlings are in tails and ball gowns. You know, like they're at some kind of elaborate wedding rather than their own house. Okay, the inspector is dressed differently. That's important. Visually sets him apart. During 1945, when it was first performed, many people were living in rationing, and therefore everybody wore the same things. The inspector wears what the audience wears, so he's seen as one of them. Okay, his appearance, like we said, is opposite to the Burlings. Dark and plainish is representative of the inspector's personality. He's not showy or ostentatious, but he's serious and sombre. And Priestley wants to see this as a man who represents us. He cutting in, really important image, stage direction that's repeated, okay? He doesn't care for the Burlings and he'll interrupt them to get to the truth because sometimes that's what we've got to do. Cutting as a verb symbolises what the inspector does with this text. He cuts through the lies and secrets of the Burlings. And I want you to remember the inspector is Priestley's voice on the stage, and therefore that forceful nature represents him finding the truth because, you know, he has to be forceful. You know, from that famous speech at the end that you'll need to know in your revision. If they don't learn the lesson, they'll be taught it in fire, blood, and in anguish. That's what he says about the Burlings. Basically, hell will come if people like the Burlings don't learn to change. Okay, through the inspector, Priestley presents the idea that if people don't learn the lessons, hell on earth will happen. Look at that list. List is infinite, is a sense of the infinite. Fire, blood, and anguish. Think about that word anguish, okay? Kind of hyperbolic for kind of total devastation, okay? If you don't learn the lesson, you'll feel bad forevermore. And that verb will is certain, that modal verb, Priestley's suggestion that it's always going to happen, okay? That if there isn't change, hell will happen for these people. And then finally, Eva Smith, the representation of the silent working class woman. Now, she never has a line in this play, and that mirrors the idea that working class women don't have a say or a voice. But Priestley wants to see this woman as an idol with morals. Just think about it. She could marry Eric and have an easy life. She could accept being the other woman for Gerald and kind of have some kind of quiet life where he'll look after her on the sly. But she doesn't. And this makes her moral in a world that's surrounded by people who are immoral. She asks for more money for the workers, doesn't she? You know, she thinks of others. Her morals remain constant. Think about Eva Smith in contrast to any of those rich characters. You know, she doesn't take a decanter and help herself, or she doesn't say, "Mummy, what a beauty." You know, she isn't thinking about herself. She's thinking about others. We're told all the way through this play that she is pretty. That's what the inspector used when referring to her, okay? And I want you to remember that Priestley was a socialist. And basically, by saying pretty, he's saying the poor aren't monsters. They're not ugly. The poor can be beautiful too, you know. And I just think that's really important. Priestley romanticises the poor here, you know. This sense that the poor can be attractive. Because, you know, in the 19th century, people saw the poor as being monstrous and kind of, you know, unattractive and subhuman even. By saying that she's pretty, it's this idea that she's got perfect humanity, and it also makes her death more tragic. Talking about tragedy, the inspector reminds us that she swallowed disinfectant and it burnt her insides out. Really visceral and violent language, okay? This suggestion that Eve is a brutal victim of the horrible actions of the rich. We feel sorrow and anger about how Eva was treated because of the brutal language, okay? He isn't just saying, oh, she passed away, or she was a hero that fell, a little bit like in Charge of the Light Brigade, okay? Priestley wants to make this sound dreadful, because this burnt represents the hell that Priestley saw the poor being put through. So burnt her insides out. It needs to sound visceral and painful, because we need to see her as the victim. And then Eric, he says these women aren't cheap labour, they're people. He's talking about Eva there. Okay, through the inspector, he realises that Eva isn't just somebody to kind of employ to do your dirty work. You know, she isn't somebody to just use. She's a real person. Even though she doesn't speak in this text at all, even though she doesn't have a line, Priestley wants to see that she's more humane than any of the rich. Okay, she's more of a person than Gerald, who's an aristocrat, or Mrs. Burling, who's upper middle class. And all the way through, we're meant to see her as the kind of tragic heroine of this play. And I want you to remember the sense that an Inspector Calls is a morality play. Just remember for me, money doesn't buy goodness. That's what Priestley's suggesting. So, you've got a few things about what they symbolise, okay? Remember, when you're out about Inspector Calls, what do these characters symbolise? What do they mean in the wider world, okay? And I think if you know those 18 quotations, you're well on the way. All right, thank you.